At my own father's retirement dinner, he stood up, tapped his glass, and thanked each of his 3 children individually for making him proud, my brother the surgeon, my sister the attorney, and then when he got to me he paused, smiled awkwardly, and simply said, "And Jordan, well, we're still figuring out what she's going to do with her life." I was 32 years old. Everyone laughed, the kind of laugh that happens when nobody's quite sure if something's a joke. What my father didn't know, what I hadn't told a single member of my family, was that 4 months earlier I'd signed the paperwork, making me CEO of a company currently valued at just under $60 million. I smiled along with everyone else that night. But by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why I let that comment stand uncorrected, and exactly what happened 9 weeks later that made sure my father never made that mistake again. Stay until the end, because the final scene of this story is the part nobody in my family saw coming. Let's get into it. My name is Jordan. I'm 32. I want to start by explaining exactly how I came to occupy the specific role I held in my family for most of my adult life, because understanding that role fully explains why my father's comment at his retirement dinner, however painful, wasn't actually surprising to me. I'm the youngest of 3 children. My older brother Marcus became a cardiothoracic surgeon following a path our parents had actively championed and celebrated from the time he first mentioned interest in medicine as a teenager. My older sister Priya became a litigation attorney at a respected regional firm, a career trajectory that similarly received consistent, enthusiastic family support and recognition throughout her education and early career. I took a considerably less conventional path. I struggled academically through much of high school, dealt with a genuine difficult period of uncertainty about direction. Throughout my early 20s, dropped out of a business program after 4 semesters and spent several years working a series of unremarkable jobs: retail management, a stint as a delivery driver, a brief attempt at real estate sales that didn't pan out, none of which fit the specific narrative of achievement my parents had grown accustomed to celebrating with my siblings. I want to be honest that my family's skepticism about my trajectory during those years wasn't entirely unreasonable, given what they could actually observe. I genuinely was struggling to find direction during my early 20s, and the pattern of comparison to Marcus and Priya's more conventional visible success became understandably, if painfully, deeply entrenched in how my family related to me during that period. What shifted gradually and largely invisibly to my family began around age 26, when I took a position as an operations coordinator at a small logistics startup, a modest, unglamorous entry point that I approached for reasons I still find difficult to fully articulate, with a level of genuine dedication and curiosity I hadn't previously brought to any of my earlier, more scattered attempts at a career. I want to walk through the following 6 years of that trajectory carefully, because the specific unglamorous texture of how it unfolded matters enormously to understanding why my family remained genuinely unaware of my actual professional growth for so long. I stayed at that logistics startup for just over 2 years, working my way from operations coordinator into a broader operations management role, developing along the way a genuine expertise in supply chain optimization that I hadn't anticipated finding myself passionate about, but that increasingly consumed my professional attention and curiosity. I want to describe the specific choice I made roughly 18 months into that role that set the actual trajectory toward everything that eventually followed. I identified a persistent, significant inefficiency in how the company handled a specific category of last-mile delivery logistics, developed largely on my own initiative during evenings and weekends, a proposed solution, and pitched it directly to the company's founders, who, to their considerable credit, took the proposal seriously and gave me the resources and authority to implement it. That project's success, a genuinely significant improvement in delivery efficiency that meaningfully impacted the company's bottom line, became the foundation for a series of subsequent opportunities. I was promoted into a director-level operations role within the following year, and shortly after that was recruited by a slightly larger logistics technology company, specifically because of the reputation that initial project had built within the industry. I want to be honest that throughout this entire period, roughly 4 years of genuine, sustained professional growth, my communication with my family about my career remained sparse and largely unremarkable in its framing. Part of this was simple habit, having grown accustomed over years to family conversations about career and achievement centering my siblings' more conventional trajectories. I developed a kind of reflexive minimalism about sharing my own professional updates, rarely volunteering details unless directly asked, and even then tending to describe my work in modest, unclear terms that didn't invite much further engagement or curiosity. I also want to be honest about a deeper, more complicated dynamic at play during this period. Some part of me I've since come to understand through considerable reflection had grown genuinely comfortable with the specific role of family underachiever in a way that made continuing to occupy that role even as the underlying reality shifted dramatically feel oddly safer than actively challenging a narrative my family had held about me for the better part of 2 decades. By age 30, following 2 years at that second logistics technology company, during which I'd risen to a vice president of operations role, I was recruited by a group of investors specifically to take over as CEO of a struggling but promising supply chain software company they'd recently acquired, tasked with executing a turnaround strategy that drew directly on the specific expertise I'd built over the preceding 6 years. I want to walk through the specific circumstances of actually becoming CEO because the process itself and my continued silence about it with my family reveals something important about how deeply entrenched the pattern of concealment had become by that point. The investors who recruited me had identified through my track record at the previous 2 companies exactly the specific operational expertise their struggling acquisition needed, a company that had genuinely strong underlying technology but had suffered from years of operational mismanagement that had left it significantly undervalued relative to its actual potential. I want to describe the actual weight of that opportunity honestly. Taking on the CEO role represented a genuinely significant professional and financial risk, requiring me to take a substantial pay cut from my previous vice president role in exchange for meaningful equity in a company whose turnaround was at the time I accepted the position far from guaranteed. I told my family almost nothing about this transition when it happened. I mentioned in passing during a family dinner around this time that I'd changed jobs and was now working in more of a leadership role at a tech company, a description vague enough that it generated minimal follow-up questions and blended in my family's understanding into the general unremarkable trajectory they'd already assumed characterized my career. Over the following 2 years, I worked with genuine intensity alongside a talented team to execute the turnaround strategy the investors had brought me in to lead, restructuring key operational processes, rebuilding critical client relationships that had frayed during the company's earlier mismanagement, and gradually methodically transforming a struggling undervalued acquisition into a genuinely thriving, rapidly growing business. By the time of my father's retirement dinner, roughly 2 years into my tenure as CEO, the company had grown its revenue by over 400%, successfully closed a significant new funding round that had established the company's current valuation at just under $60 million, and I'd become, by any reasonable external measure, a genuinely successful, accomplished executive, a reality my family remained entirely, completely unaware of. I want to walk through my father's retirement dinner in careful detail, because the specific comment that opened this story didn't emerge from nowhere. It reflected years of an established family narrative that by that point had simply continued unchallenged for so long that nobody, including my father, thought to question whether it still accurately reflected reality. The dinner itself was a warm, genuinely celebratory occasion, marking the end of my father's 32-year career as a civil engineer, attended by close family, longtime family friends, and several of my father's former colleagues. I want to be honest that I approached the evening with genuine, uncomplicated pride in my father's accomplishments, entirely separate from whatever complicated feelings I carried about my own family dynamic. About an hour into the dinner, my father stood to offer a toast thanking various people who'd shaped his career and life, eventually turning to acknowledge each of his 3 children individually. His comments about Marcus and Priya were warm, specific, and detailed, genuine, well-earned pride in their respective accomplishments, delivered with obvious affection and specificity that reflected years of engaged, detailed knowledge about their professional trajectories. When he turned to me, I want to describe the specific pause that occurred because it lasted just long enough to be genuinely visibly awkward before he landed on the comment. I opened this story with an attempt at gentle, affectionate humor that nonetheless made unmistakably clear that he genuinely believed, after 32 years of parenting, that I remained professionally adrift, still, in his own words, figuring out what I was going to do with my life. I want to be honest about my own internal reaction in that specific moment. There was genuine hurt, certainly the particular sting of having years of real, substantial professional achievement rendered completely invisible, reduced to gentle public mockery in front of family, friends, and former colleagues. But there was also something more complicated, A kind of resigned recognition that this moment, however painful, was simply the logical continuation of a pattern I had myself actively maintained for years through my own consistent silence and minimization. I didn't correct him. I smiled along with the rest of the room's uncomfortable laughter and let the toast continue. I want to walk through the several weeks following that dinner because they involved a genuine, significant internal reckoning that ultimately shaped the decision I eventually made about how and when to finally reveal the truth. I found myself in the days immediately following the dinner replaying that specific moment repeatedly, sitting with a level of hurt that surprised me somewhat given how long I'd actively participated in maintaining exactly the narrative that had produced it. I talked through the situation extensively with my partner Sam, who had watched this specific family dynamic unfold over the several years we'd been together, and who had on more than one occasion gently questioned why I continued keeping my actual professional success so consistently private from my family. Sam asked me directly during one of these conversations what I was actually afraid would happen if I simply clearly told my family the truth about my career. I sat with that question for several days before arriving at an answer that felt genuinely honest. I think somewhere along the way I'd become afraid that revealing the truth might somehow feel hollow or unsatisfying if it didn't land with the kind of dramatic impact that would finally definitively correct years of accumulated dismissal of fear that had paradoxically kept me trapped in exactly the pattern I most wanted to escape. I decided roughly 2 weeks after the dinner that I was done waiting for some perfect dramatic moment to reveal the truth. I wanted instead to find a genuine, meaningful opportunity to simply clearly share the reality of who I'd become, not for the specific satisfaction of proving my father wrong in some pointed retaliatory way, but because I'd finally arrived at a place where I no longer wanted to actively participate in maintaining a narrative about myself that had stopped being true years earlier. I want to walk through the specific opportunity that emerged roughly 9 weeks after the retirement dinner, because it arrived in a form I hadn't anticipated connected directly to my father's own professional legacy in a way that made the eventual reveal considerably more meaningful than I could have deliberately planned. My father's former engineering firm, as part of honoring his retirement, organized a modest industry event several months after his official retirement dinner, a panel discussion on infrastructure and logistics innovation, inviting several notable figures from adjacent industries to participate, an event my father was invited to attend as an honored guest given his decades of contribution to the firm. I learned about this event somewhat by coincidence. My company had been invited to participate in the panel discussion, specifically given our recent publicly reported growth and innovation in supply chain logistics technology, an invitation that arrived through entirely separate professional channels with no connection whatsoever to my father's presence at the same event. I want to describe my own reaction upon realizing this coincidence, because it presented exactly the kind of genuine, unforced opportunity I'd been hoping to find in the preceding weeks. Rather than a dramatic engineered confrontation, this represented a chance to simply naturally have my actual professional life become visible to my father in a context entirely separate from any deliberate attempt to prove a point. I confirmed my company's participation in the panel and made a specific choice not to mention to my family in advance that I would be attending, partly because I wanted to observe my father's genuine, unprompted reaction upon seeing me there in my actual professional context, and partly, I'll be honest, because some part of me still carried enough uncertainty about how the reveal might land that I wanted to control the circumstances as much as reasonably possible. I want to walk through the actual event in detail, because the specific sequence of my father's realization unfolded in a way that carried genuine, unplanned emotional weight. I arrived at the venue about 30 minutes before the panel began, and I want to describe the specific moment I spotted my father across the room engaged in conversation with several of his former colleagues, clearly enjoying the opportunity to reconnect with his professional community following retirement. I hadn't yet approached him directly, wanting to see how the moment might naturally unfold once the panel itself began. The panel discussion started with brief introductions of each participant, including their current roles and companies, a standard professional format that meant my introduction, delivered by the moderator, included my full title and company name along with a brief mention of our recent funding round and growth trajectory. I want to describe watching my father's reaction from the stage as precisely as I can remember it. I saw him from across the room register the introduction with what appeared initially to be simple confusion, a kind of double take, as though he genuinely couldn't reconcile the person being introduced with his own understanding of who I was. That confusion shifted over the following several seconds into something closer to stunned recognition, his eyes widening slightly in expression I don't think I'd ever quite seen on his face before. Throughout the panel discussion itself, which lasted just over 40 minutes, I noticed my father remaining fully intently focused on my portion of the conversation. Each time, I spoke engaging with genuine attention on substantive questions about supply chain innovation company growth strategy, the specific operational challenges we'd navigated during our turnaround questions and topics he would have had no reason to know I had any genuine expertise in whatsoever based on everything he'd previously understood about my career. I want to walk through the conversation that followed the panel because it carried a specific genuine emotional weight that I hadn't fully anticipated despite weeks of considering how this moment might eventually unfold. My father approached me almost immediately after the panel concluded, and I want to describe his expression as he did a complicated mixture of genuine pride, visible embarrassment, and something that looked unmistakably like real emotional processing happening in real time. He asked me quietly, almost tentatively, how long I'd actually been in this role, and I told him honestly the full timeline, nearly 2 years as CEO, preceded by 6 years of steady, sustained professional growth. He'd had genuinely no awareness of given how consistently I'd minimized and obscured that trajectory in our family conversations. I want to be honest about the specific moment I addressed his retirement dinner comment directly, because I chose to bring it up deliberately rather than simply letting the panel reveal stand as its own unspoken correction. I told him calmly but clearly that I understood his comment at the dinner hadn't been intended maliciously, but that it had genuinely hurt landing as the culmination of years of a family narrative about me that had simply stopped being accurate long before that dinner, without anyone, including myself, actively working to update it. My father's response in that moment carried a specific genuine humility I hadn't necessarily expected. He acknowledged directly that he'd made assumptions about my trajectory based on years of accumulated impression rather than any genuine recent engagement with who I'd actually become, and he apologized specifically and without deflection for the retirement dinner comment, understanding, I believe, for the first time with real clarity exactly how it had landed. It's been just over 8 months since that panel discussion, and I want to describe honestly where things currently stand with my family, because the shift that followed has been genuine, if considerably more gradual than the single dramatic reveal itself might suggest. My relationship with my father has evolved substantially since that day. Regular, genuine conversations about my work now punctuate our interactions in ways that simply didn't exist before, a level of curiosity and engagement that reflects real ongoing effort on his part to understand and appreciate a trajectory he'd previously known almost nothing about. My relationships with Marcus and Priya have similarly shifted, both of them expressing genuine surprise and admiration once the full picture became clear, along with a specific meaningful acknowledgement from both that they'd never actively questioned the family narrative about my supposed lack of direction, simply absorbing and repeating it without much independent reflection of their own. I've also done considerable personal reflection in the months since about my own role in maintaining that narrative for so long, understanding with more nuance now that while my family's initial skepticism during my genuinely difficult early 20s wasn't entirely unfounded, my subsequent years of deliberate minimization and silence, however understandable given that painful early pattern, also actively prevented my family from having genuine opportunities to update their understanding of who I'd become, opportunities I'd consistently, if unconsciously, withheld from them. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Family narratives once established have a genuine tendency to persist far longer than the reality they're supposedly describing sometimes, because the people holding those narratives simply never think to question them, and sometimes, as was true in my own case, because we ourselves become quietly complicit in maintaining a version of our story that stopped being accurate long before we finally found the courage or opportunity to correct it. I don't think my father's comment at that retirement dinner reflected genuine malice. I believe with real conviction that he simply hadn't updated an impression formed years earlier, never having been given genuine, clear opportunities to do so. But I also don't think that absolves the years of accumulated dismissal I experienced, nor does it change the real significant work I eventually had to do internally to stop actively participating in maintaining a narrative that no longer reflected who I'd actually become. If you've ever found yourself trapped in a family's outdated understanding of who you are, especially one you've quietly helped maintain through years of minimization or silence, I hope this story reminds you that you're allowed to simply clearly let the truth become visible on your own terms and timeline without needing it to arrive as some perfectly engineered dramatic reveal to finally genuinely matter. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments and subscribe for more real stories about family ambition and the moments when the truth finally undeniably catches up. I've got plenty more where this one came from, and the next one might just be even more unbelievable than this.